There are a lot of videos on YouTube that show you how to build a custom PC, and a lot of them are really good, but they seem to assume that you already have an understanding of computer building jargon, essential PC parts and which ones are compatible, and just a general feel of what to expect when building a computer. And if you're not to that point yet, then hopefully this video will be helpful because we'll go over parts, compatibility, pricing, and terminology to make sure that you have what you need to confidently build a PC on your own. Also, hopefully, you'll save a lot of time and money because you'll be buying parts that make sense together, and you won't be wasting time assembling parts that don't make sense together. If I could go back in time, I probably would make some different decisions in my first build. So I want to take everything I've learned so far and see if I can help you avoid making some of those same mistakes that I made. And there is a lot of information, so I'll be putting timestamps in the description in case you need to come back to this video or you want to skip around to somewhere specific in the video. All right, so the first thing that we're going to start off with is the parts you need to build a computer, because this can feel super overwhelming if you're new to building a PC. I once thought that I would need to do like a ton of soldering and like an assembly of a million different parts and sourcing different PC parts to build a PC, and that's totally not the case. You really only need about 6 to 8 things depending on the kind of computer that you're building, and that's pretty much it. Right? So the first thing you're going to need is a case, and these are commonly called chassis, and they do 3 things. First, they obviously hold all of the other parts together. All of the other parts of the computer go into the chassis. They also give you a few USB ports toward the front and maybe a headphone jack. And then finally, they give you a power button so you can turn your machine on, because that's kind of important if you plan to use your computer. The next thing you're going to need is a motherboard. Now, the motherboard is a super important part because it connects everything, like literally everything, including the case, plugs into the motherboard. And that's its primary functionality, is to connect everything. And just so you know, people online all the time abbreviate motherboard as MB because it's easier to type. So the third thing you're going to need is a processor. And this is probably the most confusing part about building a computer, mainly I think because of all of the terminology surrounding it. But the processor is the part of your computer that actually does the work, generally speaking. I mean, it's the computing part of the computer. And I'll explain more about that in another video. But if you hear someone talk about CPU, or you hear words like Ryzen 5 or i7, that's what they're talking about, is the processor. You're also going to need RAM, which is sometimes called memory, and this is where all of your programs and files are stored while you are using them. And there's a good amount to know about this subject, but basically most computer builds will want 8, 16, or 32 gigabytes of RAM, depending on what you're doing. And when you're not using your files, those files and programs will be stored on your drive, which is the 5th thing you need to get. This is where your files live most of the time. And there are different kinds of drives, including mechanical hard drives and 2 kinds of solid state drives. Different drives are used for different reasons, but you'll need at least one to store everything on your computer. And then finally, the 6th thing you're going to need is your power supply, which is sometimes called a PSU. And the PSU is like a big battery that plugs into your wall and powers everything in your system. And what you have inside your computer will determine what power supply you'll want to get. And that's it. Those are the essential pieces to building a computer. Now, there are 2 other things that you'll probably want to get, but you may not need to depending on what kind of computer you're building. One of those 2 things is a set of fans. Now, fans blow hot air off of the PC parts and out of the case so things don't overheat. You'll want a fan with a heatsink for your processor, and then a couple more fans around the case. The The reason I didn't mention these in the list of essential parts is that some cases come with fans and some processors come with fans and heat sinks, which when they're combined, a fan and a heat sink, it's called a CPU cooler. So there are some instances when you really just don't need to buy fans separately at all. And then the other thing, the second thing that you're probably going to want to get is a graphics card. And this is essentially a processor dedicated specifically for video related things like video editing, gaming, or animation. But you technically don't need one, even though if you're building your own PC, you should probably get one. Most people don't build their own computers unless they need it for something like a big task that requires a graphics card, which is also sometimes called a GPU, by the way. If you don't get a graphics card, it does limit what kind of processors you can get because some processors don't handle graphic related tasks. But like I said, you technically don't need a graphics card. Okay, so there you have it. All of the parts you need to build a PC. And maybe that seems confusing right now, but if you go back and watch this section again, it'll start to make a little bit more sense. And once you know all of the parts of building a computer and what they're called, you're like 90% there to being able to understand everything people say about computers and about building computers. And I'll put that parts list up on the screen along with their names somewhere over here again, just so you have it for quick reference. So feel free to pause the video if you need to take a look at that. All right, so now that you're familiar with all of the different parts, let's talk about making sure that those parts are compatible, because not all processors work with all different kinds of RAM, and not all power supplies fit inside all of cases, things like that. The best way to make sure that all of your parts are compatible is to pick your parts in the right order. The first part that you're going to want to pick out is your processor. Now, there is a lot to consider when buying a processor, so do some research and find out which processor is going to best fit your needs. Every processor has what's called a socket number, and the socket number is what's going to tell you what kind of motherboard to get. So if you're buying an Intel CPU, the socket number is going to start with the letters LGA. For example, you have LGA 1151 or LGA 1200, and if you're buying an AMD CPU, the socket number is going to start with AM, like AM3 or AM4. Now, once you have your processor, you can pick a motherboard. When you search for a motherboard to use, make sure that you get one that has a matching socket number to your processor. That way, you can ensure that the two pieces are in fact compatible. Now, the other big thing to consider with motherboards is the size of the motherboard. There are three standard sizes of motherboard, and they are ATX, Micro ATX, and Mini ITX, because for some reason, no naming conventions can be consistent in technology. Motherboard sizes matter because it will determine what size case you can get for your computer. Now, most Micro ATX motherboards will fit just fine in a standard ATX case, but it won't fit in a Mini ITX case. And so your case will say if it fits ATX, Micro ATX, or Mini ITX motherboards, and you'll just want to match those things up. The next thing that I would personally buy is the drive. Generally speaking, you probably don't want to get a mechanical hard drive. They're big and they're slow, and they just aren't great for everyday use. So you'll probably want to get what's called a solid state drive, or an SSD for short. Like I mentioned a little bit earlier, there are two kinds of SSDs, and they are SATA SSD and M.2 SSD. The vast majority of motherboards can take M.2 SSDs, which are faster, smaller, not much more expensive, and they require 0 cables. So if your motherboard is compatible, that's what I would get. But SATA SSDs are just fine, and I don't know of a motherboard that can't support SATA SSDs. In fact, I use a SATA SSD. All you need to do is figure out how much space you want to store your files, which will depend on what you're using your computer for. But the more space you need, the more expensive your drive will be. And that kind of makes sense. And at this point in time, you should now go pick out your RAM and your graphics card. Like the processor, you'll want to do a fair bit of research to figure out how much RAM you're going to need and what kind of graphics card you should get. I should point out that some processors and motherboards have like a cap or a limit on how much RAM they'll take and how fast that RAM can be. So you'll want to cross-reference those things with your motherboard and your CPU just to make sure that those match up. But most motherboards and RAM will be just fine for your use case. The last two things you'll want to get are your fans and heatsink, and then your power supply. And by this point, you can go back and look and see if your processor comes with a cooler and if your case comes with fans. If it doesn't, go ahead and pick those out. Now, there are a lot of coolers and fans out there, and there is some controversy about which fans and coolers are best, but just know that most fans will do just fine at cooling your computer. Some are slightly more quiet and some are slightly cooler, but the vast majority of brands and models will probably fit your needs. I mean, just don't buy the cheapest one you can find. That one probably does, in fact, actually suck. One thing to consider with your cooler though is whether it will fit inside your case. Now, most fans will fit inside a standard ATX case, but you'll want to double check just in case. And if you get an AIO cooler or an all-in-one cooler, odds are that that will fit just fine as well, since they're typically smaller than fan coolers. Okay, so lastly, you're gonna wanna buy the power supply. Now that you have all of your other pieces, you obviously need to power them, and which pieces you got will determine how much power you need. The website newegg.com has a calculator, which I'll put in the description below, that tells you how many watts your PSU needs to supply. Like I said, I'm gonna link that down in the description below so you can go and calculate how much you need based on the parts that you got. Whatever number that calculator gives you, add about an extra 100 watts and treat that as your minimum. Generally speaking, the lower the number, the more affordable the power supply. But sometimes you can get some high wattage power supplies for really good deals. So don't automatically count out the higher wattage power supplies and higher performing power supplies just because you think they're gonna be more expensive. It is best practice to make sure that your power supply is what's called 80+ certified. There's 80+ gold, bronze, silver, platinum. That doesn't matter so much. Just make sure that it's 80+, or that it has an 80+ certification. People say it helps like your PSU not explode, which, you know, is a nice feature. As I mentioned earlier, some cases require smaller power supplies, so just be sure to check if yours requires a normal power supply or an SFF power supply. Now, let's talk about pricing. This will obviously vary widely, and the more performance you want out of your computer, generally the more it will cost. So you can build a computer for a couple $100, or you could spend literally tens of thousands of dollars building the best computer out there. But the question is how much are parts generally speaking? Are there ballpark estimates to know how much like good parts cost? And the answer is yes. There are very common pieces for parts to give you an idea of how much everything will cost. That way you'll know if something is too good to be cheap or too cheap to be good. So starting with our processor, a good performing mid-range processor runs between $200 and $350. Anything above that, and you should be expecting stellar out of this world performance, and anything below that, and you should probably be considering that a budget option. Motherboards can run all over the place in terms of price, ranging upwards of $400, but it's really unnecessary to spend more than $150 on a motherboard unless you need a really specific feature and you know exactly what you're looking for. Now, there's not a lot of performance that's derived from the motherboard, so I recommend getting something in between $80 and $100, somewhere in that range, just because you probably don't need anything more. RAM is about how much you need. The average gamer or professional typically doesn't need more than 16 gigabytes of RAM, which will run you around $100. And if you want to have fancy RGB lights on it, it'll probably be closer to $150. An SSD will run you about $50 to $100 for about a half a terabyte of storage. Obviously, depending on whether it's SATA or M.2 and what brand you're getting. If you're watching this video in 2021, then the graphics cards are going to be the most expensive expensive piece of your computer by far. Usually this piece will be about $300 to $400 to match the other specs that I've listed so far, but right now there's a shortage of supplies to create graphics cards, so they're about double that price or even triple that price right now. But we're going to keep that $300 to $400 price range as a baseline when graphics cards normalize in their price. Coolers and fans will run about $50 if you get a nice one. A case will be $50 to $100, much more if you get a really fancy one. A power supply for this system will probably be around $50 to $100. Now, don't hate me, but that puts the cost of building a solid gaming computer between $890 and $400, which is a huge range, but it is pretty accurate. So it's not cheap, but there are things that you can do to cut the price down a lot without cutting the performance too much, like getting previous generations of processors and motherboards, or even graphics cards, getting a cheaper case, using a fan CPU cooler instead of an AIO cooler, or buying on the used market. All of these things will dramatically cut the price without sacrificing much performance at all. So there you have it. Everything you should know before building a computer yourself. You know the parts, you know the terminology, you know how to find compatible pieces, and you know the general pricing to build a decent system. So now you can go buy all of those parts and watch one of those build guides on YouTube. So thank you so much for watching, and we will see you in the next one.